Massachusetts and Massachusetts. And I know we have some friends here from other places as well. We are very glad you're here. I'd like to introduce Martha Gardner, who is the Missioner for Networking and Formation for the Diocese of Massachusetts, who is our tech host tonight, and she has some housekeeping tips for us. Martha.
Thank you, Margaret. So welcome all. As you probably noticed as you came in, we have muted you and we have kept it so you cannot unmute yourself until you go into breakout rooms later in the session. If you want to, as we've been saying, put your name and town and congregation or organization in the chat. We'd love to know who's here. And also, again, my name is Martha Gardner. So if you have any technical difficulties or whatever, you can just send me a chat. I have started recording this. And so if for any reason you don't want your face to be recorded, you just turn your video off. But we have told people we're going to record these for those that can't be at all the sessions. And they'll be posted on the 2 diocesan web pages on the Creation Care pages. And I think that's it for me, Margaret.
Thanks, Martha. So I'm Margaret Bullitt-Jonas, and I serve the Diocese of Western Massachusetts as Missioner for Creation Care and the Diocese of Massachusetts as Creation Care Advisor. And in a moment, I'm going to pass the baton to my friend and colleague, Lisa Hildebrandt, who is co-convener of the Creation Care Justice Network in the Diocese of Massachusetts. And she is currently incubating a new church community focused on creation and climate justice. So, as you know, the purpose of this series is to build community and to expand our spiritual and physical capacity to respond to the climate crisis. Building on a resolution passed at the Massachusetts Diocesan Convention on March 23rd, the 3 bishops of our 2 dioceses made a strong and comprehensive declaration that we are in a climate emergency. We are grateful to our bishops and to those who wrote the original resolution and provided input to the declaration. So the question is, okay, now what? How will we build on that? So these webinars will offer some tools and provide ways for us to connect as we pray and think through how we as people of faith will respond. And we offer these webinars in hopes that they will feed us and support us as we move forward. If you doubt the reality of climate change or the climate emergency, these are not the webinars for you. If you like, you can email Lisa or me and we will respond to you outside of this time. For now, in these conversations, we take as a given that global heating is real, that the people and creation are groaning, and that we are called to respond. As we get started, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. As residents of Massachusetts, we occupy the land of the Massachusetts, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Nauset, Pocumtuck, and Mohican indigenous tribes. If you want to know whose land you are on, you can go to native-land.ca, and I'm going, I hope, to drop that into the chat if you'd like to look that up. One last comment before we get really launched. We have speakers and presenters in each webinar, but there are really no experts here. We have never lived through this challenge before, and we are all just making it up as we go along. Each presenter brings some knowledge, some experience, some faith, which we cherish. And we will spend time in small groups sharing the knowledge and experience and faith that you bring. The climate crisis is not going to be solved by experts, but creatively lived into by all of us through relationships and community. So tonight we will start with a prayer and then a brief overview of what we will be doing in our webinar, which tonight will focus on learn. There is a lot we need to learn. And so now over to Lisa Hildebrandt. Thanks, Lisa.
Sorry. Yes. I invite you to sit up in your chair and maybe relax your shoulders and your jaw and take in a deep breath and exhale. So let us settle into this space and let us pray. Creator God, you have made us so that learning, memories, and experiences lodge in our limbs and organs, as well as our minds. Bring your calming, inquiring spirit upon us. Open our brains and our bodies to new understandings of the climate emergency and its social context. Renew our convictions that you are powerfully present in the midst of all the suffering and the change. Help us to process what we hear and strengthen our resolve to move into, not away from, the challenges of these times. We thank you for the community assembled here tonight and for the love, fortitude, and hope that you give us through your incarnate Christ, our brother Jesus. And let the people say, Amen. So tonight's focus will be on some key things that we need to learn. First of all, what is the climate emergency? You probably understand this, but it's nice to have a brief recap of why this issue is so pressing. Then, what are some of the biblical and theological resources that can help us respond to the climate crisis? And finally, how does the climate emergency connect with other justice issues that we care about? Our first presenter tonight is Bette Hecox-Lea. Bette is a research associate at the Marine Biology Laboratory at Woods Hole. She is the chair of the Outreach Ministry at St. Barnabas, Falmouth, and she's a member of both the communications and the action and advocacy working groups of the Creation Care Justice Network of the Diocese of Massachusetts. In our diocese, she initiated the idea of passing a climate emergency resolution at convention, and she has worked tirelessly to alert people on Cape Cod and in the wider church to the severity of the climate crisis and to encourage communities to take action. So Bette, it's all yours. Please tell us about the climate emergency.
Well, thank you very much. I get to be the bearer of impending doom or something, right? Let me share my screen. I have some slides to go. There. That should look okay for everyone. So tonight I'm going to talk in just about 10 minutes on what is the climate emergency, what are the root causes of it, and what our emergency response should be. And before I get started, I just want to give a shout out to the rector at St. Barnabas, Reverend Will Mebane, who was very open to listening to me and my concerns about addressing the climate emergency. And actually, I think he is the one who told me to go ahead and try and put this in as a resolution. And he's been very helpful and encouraging for me to learn the intersectionality of this in our social justice issues. I'd also like to thank Episcopal City Mission and the Pachamama Alliance, an online learning group, for really helping inform me. So there is a climate emergency because tipping points are active. That is the full story. Tipping points, also called feedback loops. And this is a picture that identifies 15 tipping points, which are really large system level changes that will start to shift as the Earth starts to warm. You don't need to worry about the colors in this picture. You don't really need to worry about the arrows, although they are interconnected. But what you see here is we have the ice sheets, the big polar frozen regions of both the North Pole and the South Pole, the glaciers. We have the big circulatory systems of the Earth, the jet stream in the air, circulatory systems, the ocean, the monsoons, and we have ecosystems at risk of of a shift, an irreversible change in what they currently are. That's the boreal forests, the Amazon rainforest, coral reefs, the Sahel of Africa, and the permafrost in the tundra. So you can probably stop and think about what you've heard. You probably know ice is melting. You probably know Greenland glaciers are going. And these are being driven both by human emissions and by just the loss of life. The way the science phrase that is biosphere degradation. The biosphere represents all of the life covering the surface of the earth, from microbes to whales. And it's in an extinction event. It's in a mass extinction event. If we step back and we look at the progression of warming, just without numbers, without parts per million of CO2 or anything like that, as the globe warms, the first thing we hit is dangerous conditions. These are extreme weather events often, fires, flooding rains that didn't used to happen that much. One thing we got on Cape Cod, where I am, is tornadoes. They didn't used to be able to build the kind of energy needed to have a tornado on Cape Cod. After the dangerous stuff comes catastrophic changes. Those tipping points become activated. And you see the bleaching of the coral reefs. You see changes in the jet stream. You see the loss of the ice. And fun note, my slides are advancing themselves, so I'll keep up. What comes after post-catastrophic changes is not known. At the time of the writing of the Zoo and Ramanathan reference that's mentioned in the quarter of the slide, no scientist anywhere would make a prediction about what comes next. They would only call it existential threats. Later, Stefan in 2018 said this is where you get to the hothouse Earth scenario. Once those tipping points go, the Earth will become too hot for life as we know it to inhabit. The most concerning thing about that is the fact that as the tipping points begin to shift and change, there is expected to be a point, a threshold of no return, when the Earth will sort of snatch back the control from the humans who are causing the warming and really rapidly shift climate to the hothouse scenario. That planetary threshold was expected to be happening around 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And that's why you hear, I believe, that number coming from Paris, coming from the intergovernmental panels, things like that.
Eddie, can you explain what the PNAS journal is? Some people are asking that in the chat. Do you know what that stands for? Thank you.
It stands for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. And I'm happy to send those references out later. I want to dig into one of my favorite feedback loops, tipping point, because it's really the one that sort of opened my eyes to what was going on, which happened around 2015 when we got blizzards every 3 days for a month here in Massachusetts. And I realized sometime later that it was because the polar jet stream was oscillating. So this image that is from 2015, as it happens, is something you're probably pretty familiar with from your evening news, from the weather. We see now the polar jet stream making these big north and south dips. And what's happening is the jet stream is a stream like any that you know on Earth. It's flowing down a gradient. But instead of flowing down a slope and terrain, it's flowing down the temperature gradient between the very cold pole and the very warm equator. And not so many years back, right, this used to be a lot faster moving stream that didn't wobble because it was more like a mountain stream, because there was a big temperature difference between the pole and the equator. It doesn't flow north to south, it flows east to west, of course, because the Earth turns beneath it. So now, for whatever reason, the polar regions are warming much faster than the rest of the planet. So that slope is leveling out, and it's like a river that has hit the plains, and it's starting to become sinuous and meander. And we know this is affecting our weather. This is what brings a cold snap down into Texas. This is what brings 100-degree temperatures up into Siberia and Alaska. These vertical places where it's flowing north and south is where we get the really rapid temperature shifts of tens and tens of degrees now, even here on the East Coast. And it also is, got less energy. It's not steering the way it used to. Weather is harder to predict. Storm tracks are more difficult. But as this flows north, in particular, you start to see the feedback nature of this. As warm air rises up over the Arctic ice, over Greenland, the sea ice, it melts it, which takes away the bright white reflective surface, leaves darker ocean, darker ice behind, which absorbs more heat, which causes the jet stream to oscillate. The jet stream swings up over the land, and it begins to thaw the permafrost. Permafrost, when I learned it, it was in the tundra. Any soil more than 6 inches deep was always frozen. And that is now starting to thaw. Scientists liken it really to a freezer of just full of chicken that's been left open, because there is a lot of material there to still be broken down, which itself is a testament to how quickly it got cold. So that permafrost starts to thaw. It's waterlogged soil, and it rots. It puts out methane instead of carbon dioxide. And methane is 30 times better at trapping heat than carbon dioxide is, which warms the Arctic, which causes the jet stream to oscillate. So you can see this going back and forth, and it connects to a few other things too that I won't get into here. So that's how that's working. That's the emergency. And now I have this weird picture of a tree, which is to remind me to talk about the roots. Whenever you run into a problem, when you hit an emergency, when you hit a bad thing that happens, the important thing is to stop and figure out what happened. Determine the root cause so that you can effectively treat that problem. As Thoreau said, there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root. I will say here again, my slides are advancing without me, so I may be stopping the slideshow early if I need to. The root of our problems is overconsumption. So thinking about this, it's yes, fossil fuel burning, but more than that. If you think about basic human needs for food, shelter, clothing, natural materials, and people, we need these things. Pretty simple, basic behavior in biology. And if you have a little more, if you get a few more resources to make you more comfortable, to make it better, then you're going to be a little more fit, and your kids are going to be a little more fit. And so that's all good. That's how we work. But at some point, the greed, kind of at the level above the individual sometimes, the greed can step in, and really bad things can develop from this, like climate change and extinction as we exploit the natural resources, like really awful things, social justice and slavery, poverty, oppression, genocides, when we begin to see people as a resource that can be exploited if you have the power to do it. So when you look at this graph, right, climate change and extinctions are right next to each other because they are tightly linked. And yeah, those branches are on fire right now, but they are still branches of this tree. And we shouldn't think of these efforts as being siloed. We all need to work against the root of the problem. And I like to think instead of climate change and the extinctions as like the ultimate disruptor that will cause us to right now start uprooting this tree. And what the emergency response should look like: we are in an emergency that will become unmanageable or unsurvivable if we don't act immediately. Our goal needs to be carbon negative, which means we remove more carbon from the atmosphere than we put into it. If the emergency is caused by overconsumption, then the solution is conservation and restoration as our guiding principles. Eco-justice to guide us, which is justice that, in addition to doing the right thing by our fellow humans, really looks with compassion on all life on Earth and treasures it and puts its needs first, and then resilience to get through the tough times ahead. This is the end of my talk. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you so much. It's such a clear and pithy overview of the unprecedented situation in which we find ourselves. Thank you, Betty. I'd like to take 10 minutes to speak about how we connect the climate emergency with our Christian faith. We're going to do this really quickly. we're all used to thinking of the climate crisis as a scientific issue, a political issue, an economic issue. And that makes sense because it is all of these and more. But what is a Christian perspective on the climate emergency? What wisdom from scripture and theology do we bring to the table? So to answer that question quickly, I think I'm going to start by contrasting a Christian perspective with the perspective of the dominant culture in which we live. As I see it, the dominant Western worldview is that the proper relationship between human beings and the rest of the natural world, the proper relationship is one of mastery. Humans are here to master and dominate the natural world, and nature is composed of inert matter and forces that human beings have a right to manipulate and exploit for our own purposes. This worldview assumes that human beings are fundamentally separate from, different from, and lucky for us, better than all the other creatures on the earth, and that we should have dominion or power over them. This worldview also assumes that the world is vast and that humans have, or they should have, unlimited opportunities to consume and use up and throw away the so-called resources that have been placed here for our disposal. This way of looking at the natural world around us is so basic to our culture. I think it's in the air we breathe and the water we drink. And as I know Reverend Natalie will say in a few moments, walk us through this a bit more, there are many ways in which Western Christianity has been hijacked by this worldview and used as a way of justifying it. Nature has been viewed as irrelevant, the backdrop to the only drama that really matters, which is the human drama, or nature has been viewed as simply something to be consumed and used up. Sally McFague is a theologian who calls that the Kleenex perspective of the world. It's the perspective in which we treat the world not as our home that we treat with love and care and respect, but rather like a hotel. When we visit a hotel, it can be tempting to feel entitled to use copious amounts of hot water, to throw towels on the floor, and to discard everything in sight and then head to the next hotel, right? That's the Kleenex perspective. And it's clear where that worldview has led us. It's led us straight to a precipice in which a dominating extractionist way of inhabiting Earth is tearing apart the web of life and rendering our planet increasingly difficult for humans and other beings to inhabit. So a Christian ecological worldview is very different from that dominant paradigm, and I will just cite some principles. God loved the world into being and pronounced it very good and entrusts it to our care. The dominion that we are granted in the first chapter of Genesis is not divine permission for humanity to dominate and abuse the world. This is what Alcoholics Anonymous would call self-will run riot. I think of dominion rather as loving the world as God loves it. A Christian ecological perspective says humans are part of life. We are not above it or separate from it. And we have a unique calling, what the second chapter of Genesis calls a responsibility to till and keep the garden. So that means that our very first vocation as human beings is to be a blessing on God's creation. We often call this stewardship, our task to safeguard Earth rather than to ransack and plunder it. But honestly, for me, I think the word steward sometimes to me sounds rather wimpy when it comes to what's needed right now from communities of faith and from humanity itself. So I'm pondering, what would it mean to call ourselves sacred activists with a sacred purpose, or spiritual warriors engaged in sacred activism? Another principle is the earth does not belong to us. It belongs to God. Just take a look at the first verse of Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. So that means the earth is not just the stage for the human drama of salvation. It has divine purposes of its own. Earth and all her creatures have intrinsic value. And if you have any doubt about that, take a look at Psalm 104. Nature is full of delight. God delights in the diversity of nature, which is here for its own, for the pleasure of God, for its own good reasons. So I think it's high time to restore a sense of reverence for God's creation, to dismantle the fossil fuel mindset that the natural world is nothing more than inert material, an object for us to exploit. In fact, the earth is one of the main places that we encounter God. That is the testimony of generations of Christian mystics and theologians, beginning with St. Paul. Like the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, we affirm the world is charged with the grandeur of God. So destroying the earth is a desecration. It is a sin against the Creator. Final point I want to make. We are called to love our neighbors. We all know we are called to love our neighbors. Are we loving our neighbors when we drown them, starve them, force them to uproot themselves from their homelands? The rising seas and droughts and extreme storms amplified by climate change are already harming innumerable neighbors, especially in the global south. Our neighbors include low income and people of color communities. And those are the folks who are hurt first and worst by the effects of a changing climate. And so that's where climate justice intersects with racial justice. In fact, I've heard it said that we wouldn't have climate change without white supremacy. Where would we put our urban oil fields? Where would we put our dumping grounds and trash, our biomass plants, our toxic incinerators, and all the other polluting industries? Where would we put them if we weren't willing to sacrifice Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities? And here I want to quote from the Sierra Club's Director of Organizational Transformation, which I think is one of the best job titles I've ever heard of, Director of Organizational Transformation. His name is Hop Hopkins, and he says, "You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones. And you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism." The neighbors we are called to love also include future generations, all those who depend on us to leave them a habitable world. And our neighbors also include our other than human kin, all those creatures with whom we share the planet. So let's not forget, in that story of Noah, right at the end of that story, God forges what scripture tells us is an everlasting covenant, not only with human beings, but also with every living creature. They too are the neighbors we are summoned to love. God is in covenant with all life. So I will conclude just by saying, these are just some of the principles that inform Christian eco-theology. To me, I think that we human beings, especially we humans here in the West, we are on a long journey back to understanding our connection with the earth. I see that as the great task before us in a time when the life systems of earth are deeply compromised, when many of us are deeply alienated from the earth. How will we find our way back to union with God and all God's creation? That is a spiritual journey we all need to be embarking on. How will we reclaim the ancient Christian understanding, which was never lost by indigenous peoples or by the so-called pagans? that the natural world is sacred, that it belongs to God, and that it is filled with God. How will we reclaim our partnership, both with other human beings and also with all the other living creatures with whom we share this planet? This is quite the adventure that we are all on, and I'm glad we're in it together. So, our third speaker tonight is the Reverend Natalie Thomas, who is the Director of Engagement and Communications at Episcopal City Mission. She is also a deacon in the Diocese of Massachusetts, and she serves at St. Barnabas, Falmouth. So let's do a shout out to St. Barnabas, Falmouth, which is such a role in leading the way forward. Thank you, Natalie. Over to you.
Thank you. I know, well represented. I'm very grateful to be here with Betty and also with you, Margaret, two people I have a lot of admiration for. And so my name is Natalie, my pronouns are she, her, and I have been asked to share a little bit of today about the intersection of climate justice and other areas of justice. And to do that, I'm going to be sharing a frame with y'all that I learned from the Massachusetts Community Action Network. They're a partner of Episcopal City Mission, where I currently work. And they think about injustice as the house that we live in. And so as you can see in the top left corner, they talk about living in an American empire. And when they talk, when we're using the term empire, what we're meaning to say there is a country or a political force that exerts domination on other people. And so America's kind of conquering of the US, manifest destiny, the colonialism, neocolonialism that it's had around the world, just this concept of a people or a country that exerts force over other folks. And what they have taught me is that that sort of way of being in the world, the domination mindset that Margaret referred to, the overconsumption mindset that Betty referred to, is always grounded by four foundations. And you can see them in this blue foundation level at the bottom. The first one being white supremacy. And I won't go so much into that since Margaret just shared about that, but that is in basic the belief that the white culture and the white way of being is somehow inherently better. It has led to racism, it has led to pain, and it has led to destruction or near destruction of culture. The second is patriarchy. And patriarchy is the belief that I will say maleness, so which non-maleness would include people who identify as women, people who identify as non-binary, the trans community, the idea that the quote male way of being, that men have some sort of authority and order that we need to follow. The third being capitalism, and I will refer back again to Betty's greed there, just the desire for more and more, and the primary resource of money being centered over relationships and over care of creation. And then finally, imperial Christianity. And that links to what Margaret was saying about the idea that sometimes the church has actually colluded to support these other three things, that rather than being the alternative way that we are called to be as Christians that stands in opposition to these three things, the church and the way it's set itself up, think about, a long time ago, when explorers, settlers, domineers were coming over, the church was a leading force in that, right? And converting people as they were coming. Even just in the last political administration, Jeff Sessions is using the Bible to justify deportation of people, right? So these things are historical, and they are also currently active. And why we talk about those four foundations is because to know the intersection of all these different areas of injustice that we talk about, MCAN has kind of a list here, how the economy is set up, how the penal incarceration is set up, how our political system is set up, we really have to look at those 4 underlying issues. And if we understand those 4 issues, and if we are intentional about addressing those in whatever justice area we are addressing, we will attack the foundation of the house. Okay, so we know that environmental injustice, I added that one. You can see it's different. They didn't have it there, but I figured we needed to add it for this session. But, you know, the way we treat the environment and the way the economy is set up both support injustice. So how do we move intersectionally is we think about these 4 issues. So the way we address environmental injustice pays attention to racism, pays attention to capitalism, pays attention to patriarchy. Then I can guarantee you, you will be not only benefiting the environment, you will also be addressing other injustices, right? So what I'd like us to spend some time with in the big group is actually looking at 2 environmental justice issues, slides, there we go, and thinking about the ways that the 4 foundations play into it. So this is a quote clean power plant that was just built in Omaha recently. It was built near a primary Latino neighborhood. And there is, admitted concern about this power plant. So what I would love, either if people, I don't think people can come off mute. So you're gonna have to use the chat for this section. Or maybe you can raise your hand and I can unmute you. I think that also will work, is to think about how was this decision to build this power plant near a Latino neighborhood influenced by white supremacy or influenced by capitalism? Martha can unmute people if you raise your hand. Or influenced by this idea of Christian imperialism or patriarchy. So why don't we either you can share in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you have something that you want to share with the group, and we can unmute you. Folks can unmute themselves if you want to share.
So what do you mean by the clean power plan?
Well, that's a good point. So I can't see who's talking. You're not popping up on my screen. Whose voice am I hearing?
Betsy.
Betsy. Okay, so Betsy, why are you inquiring, why it says clean power plan? Can you share more about that?
On the surface of it, clean power sounds like that might be a good plan. Obviously, putting a power plant anywhere is, making a footprint that's not trees or grass or housing, or, it's not addressing some of the other issues. But the question about whether it's clean power suggests that, I don't know, maybe there are some benefits there too. So that's
why.
Yeah.
So I think that they are billing this as a clean power plan. I think that, one of the things you're raising though is I would connect to capitalism, right? So some things are getting named clean power that are not actually clean power because of the financial benefits that certain groups are getting, right? And so I think that's worth investigating, right? Is this actually clean power, or have people just been lobbying to call natural gas clean power and it's actually not clean, right? So I think these questions you're asking tie to these intersections. Amanda, do you want to come off mute and share what you put in the chat? Amanda Slinkowski?
Sure. I just, what we were talking about regarding the Sierra Club, it just seemed to really fit that sort of model of thought process that perhaps the consideration or not for the people in that community was not taken into account because maybe they were considered not as important or their needs were not as valued.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, thank you. That's, I wouldn't say thank you, that's good, but yes, thank you, that's right. And I think you can look systemically and see someone else put in the chat whose voices are being heard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who was in the room to negotiate this, which I would also connect. I don't know who was in the room. I don't have the like exact details about how this decision was made, but this is a decision that gets made over and over again. This is not a one-time decision to put a power plant in a vulnerable neighborhood. And likely because of just the way systems have gone, my guess is that the decision was also made probably primarily by men, in the room. That's just a guess of the demographics of who are in our political and business corporate structures. And Alex has his hand up, so I will call on him.
Hi, yeah. A few points. One, we know that people of color tend to be concentrated into geographical areas due to lots and lots of history of programs like redlining and zoning and other mechanisms that have been used to preserve white neighborhoods and keep other people out of them. So that's part of the white supremacy culture.
Mm-hmm.
It's also the case that the regulatory system, including the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and similar state agencies, really work in partnership with the utilities in order to approve projects, whether communities want them or not. And there's long history of that, including in New England, including in Massachusetts. You just have to look at the struggle against the Weymouth gas compressor station, and you can see that whole bureaucracy in operation on the side of the utilities. And third, it can be incredibly expensive to fight these placements and take years and years. And the utilities have so much wealth and so much political influence that it is really a David and Goliath struggle in order for communities to get justice.
Right. And then to connect that back to capitalism, thank you, Alex, incredible analysis of the situation, very grateful for that. And to connect it back to capitalism, why do the electrical companies have power, the lobbying groups, the money that's being putting into this? So there's really intersection of all of these foundational issues. We were going to do another example, but I'm watching the time and I want to give you time in small groups. That's really important. But the other example that I was going to have us look at is the drilling of pipelines in Canada. I mean, this is again similar foundations of where we're deciding to drill, whose voices matter, profit over people, and Christian imperialism, the value of degradation of indigenous cultures, and also kind of this core idea of connecting the church to being about domination rather than about care, which is, I'm not suggesting that's what the church is supposed to be about. I'm saying that because of its historical ties, it has taken on that identity at times. So instead, though, instead of doing this another example, what I want to draw our attention to is what it means to be part of the movement, like Betty said. How do we move towards healing? And if somebody else, who else can come off mute, maybe? Betsy, I see your point about the clean energy plant. And I just want to say that even if that was clean energy, like 100% clean energy, if the plant is having an impact on the community that it's built next to, there are still things to be taken into account. And so that's why when doing the work of climate justice, we have to pay attention to the foundational issues so that we don't cause harm as we're moving towards justice, right? So you still have to think about these questions. If you're building a solar farm, right? Kind of where you build it, who has decision-making power about it. No matter what is being built, there's this attention to how whiteness, how capitalism is influencing the decisions we're making. And that allows us to address climate change intersectionally and not just with one kind of single focus lens. So I'm, at the sake of hearing my voice too much, I'm going to read this quote to everyone, the risk of it. So remember to imagine and craft the world you cannot live without, just as you dismantle the ones you cannot live within. By Ruha Benjamin, and this is by an East Asian artist. The image, Ashley Lukajewski. And this is just a nod to sometimes it's easy because there's so much pain all around us to focus on what it means to dismantle, to address climate justice, to take down the structures that are causing the climate crisis. But we also have to focus on building the new. And to me, that's really connected to our Christian call of being an alternative way in the world, of centering the values that Margaret talked about, of creating the new world just as we address the old. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to spend some time in small groups, and you're going to have a chance to think about what it means to craft the new world. And we've put together 7 examples of ways you might imagine the new. And I'm not going to read through all of them. You can look at them right now, but they're also going to be in a Google Doc that you're going to get. And you're going to go into small groups, and you're going to think about how you might do this kind of project in a way that pays attention to racism, patriarchy, Christian imperialism, and capitalism. So there's ways to build a community garden that are mindful of the class, race, community context that you're in. There are also ways to do it that are ambivalent to that, right? So we want to be thinking about how we do these things in ways that address those foundational issues. I'm putting a link in the chat right now, and everyone should have access to it. You should all be able to open it. And once you get into that doc, you're going to see your name by a group. I've assigned y'all into groups. And you're going to do these 4 things. Your first, pay attention to your group number as you get into breakout groups and find the space for your notes on the doc. And then 2, you're going to choose an example. Again, the examples are on the Google Doc, so you didn't have to remember them from that slide. And then as a group, you're going to think about how to do that climate justice project in a way that builds the new. And I'm asking you to take notes. Well, 1, so you can learn from one another. And 2, we're going to hear some examples in the big space afterwards. And it would be helpful to see kind of what y'all are thinking about as you're thinking. And I'm going to put these, let me do this really quickly. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you don't have to see this. And I'm going to put these 4 questions in the chat just so y'all can all have them in the chat when you go into small groups. Okay, so I'm going to open the groups. I would gently encourage you to choose your example quickly because you only have 10 minutes. And so if one of you is drawn to an example, this is the time to just say, what if we worked on this? Or you can use your number. Maybe pick the one that corresponds to your number. This is an exercise in imagination. No one's going to be graded on it, and draw on the wisdom and the resource of each other in the group. And with that, I'm going. Great, I think we are all back. and I am going to, I've been watching y'all's good work in this doc, and I would love to start with someone from group 8 who thought about establishing a sustainable community garden to share. And so that's either Kate, Leslie, Norman, Robert, Stephen, or Susan. If one of you wants to put your hand up, I can ask you to share with the group how you thought about building a community garden in a way that addresses the foundational issues of injustice. Susan, I'm going to ask you to unmute. I can see you're talking. Yeah.
I think I'm the only one who took notes. I'm not sure.
Great. So why don't you share some of what y'all talked about?
Well, what we were talking was about doing something that would be my host has spotlighted my video. Okay.
Yeah, welcome.
Oh, well, hi. I can't see it, but you all can. Establishing this sustainable community garden had several aspects to it, and a couple of people in our group were attempting to, or had attempted to do that in their parishes. It would include people, some of the suggestions were it would include people from outside the parish, that they would be training people to grow things. I mean, teaching people to grow a garden, perhaps using specific and local crops. One of the groups was trying to do fruit trees. And distribute to others who don't have a balanced diet. It must be have a low carbon footprint, using regenerative farming, which is a different kind of gardening where we would use natural types of manure and that sort of fertilizer, perhaps using rainwater instead of hitting on the system. Growing from organic seeds, managing insects with in a natural manner. And then we were talking about how to get people to come and join it. And in some places it's a very popular, but what we're talking about is not one of those ones that is everybody has their own plot, but that we're teaching a large group of people to join as a group, as a community, and build something that would feed the community at large, or a greater community as well as ourselves.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, group, the whole group, for that, that y'all worked on that. And just kind of want to touch one point on what you said about deciding what to grow and making sure it wasn't just about the church. It's just a super note that it's super important when we're starting things like projects like that. Someone's dog is barking, not mine in this instance. If you could mute yourself, whoever has a dog barking, we can hear it. That thinking about bringing in people early into the project, right? So if you want to build a community garden that's not just for the church, how do you bring people in to see what people want to grow? Where are the places food is needed? How are people gardening in their own spaces, right? Like really to mine is not the right verb there, to dig and till, that's the verb I'm looking for, to till the wisdom of the wider community and bring them in as partners early. So great, really great thoughts. And I know there are a lot of schools that work, schools that have vegetable shortages that work with community gardens. So these are things churches can think about. We have a quick 2 minutes left in my session, and I'd love someone from group 1 to come off mute and talk about thinking about a renewable energy source. And I'm going to put the notes that they put in there for people who want to read them, but someone from group 1. So that's either Deborah. How about Sue Swanson? I know you want to come off. Yeah,
sure. I was the note taker, so I should take responsibility for the problems. We struggled a little bit in the beginning to figure out exactly what the question was, but we did finally focus on it. And I think the main thing we were talking about is how important, this is building on some of what was said today, how important it is to get all the stakeholders, all the people that are going to be impacted by any kind of a facility together from the very beginning, so that no one is no one who's going to be impacted is left out of the decision-making process. Because this was a very ambitious goal that this hypothetical town had, there was some concern that maybe it would be more effective if we developed a consortium of multiple towns in the area, and so that this was a joint effort and not just a do-it-yourself effort. So
Yeah.
that, I think we got off to a good start, I think, but that's as far as we got.
Yeah, it's a great start. That's a great start. I love the attention to bringing in other stakeholders and working as a consortium. There was another group that thought about that in detail, and the notes are in the doc. I'd recommend reading them. I think it's group 5, talked a lot about aggregation, and it's such a, working in aggregation or co-op consortium is so important because it just pools the resources in ways that can't be pooled when we're thinking in terms of capitalism, yours, mine, right? Thinks about ours. And just a last nod from my good friend Betty, that always reminds us to think of the stakeholder of the earth too, as we're building these renewable sources of energy. And if we're destroying earth, capitalist prop principle that earth is less important than money, then we aren't caring for creation as we build these new forms of energy. So to really think about the form of life that's impacted in that way. And with that, at I think 8:11, which is my time, I will pass it back to Lisa, I think. Thank you.
That's right. Great. Thank you so much, Natalie, Betty, and Margaret. I hope this was helpful and stimulating. Just to look forward, we thank you that you have been continuing our conversation around the climate emergency, and next week we'll be looking at the third plank of the Bishop's Declaration of Climate Emergency, which is ACT. Same time, same place, same Zoom platform next week. We will discuss what we can do on a local level to address the climate emergency, what next action steps we can take, both as individuals and as communities of faith. And our speakers will include Alex Chatfield, who is from St. Anne's in the Field, Lincoln, and a very active climate activist, and the Reverend Rachel Field from the Good News Gardens, which was referenced tonight, and also Margaret Thurston, who works with CREW, that is Communities Responding to Extreme Weather. So it should be really great slate of speakers next week. I'm looking forward to it. And we will put in the chat again how you can contact our websites in the Diocese of Massachusetts and Western Massachusetts, how you can sign up for our respective newsletters, and how you can contact Margaret or me or our presenters for tonight. So we hope you will avail yourselves of those. However, at the end of the 4 weeks, we will send out an email with all these resources listed. So I am going to finally turn this back over to Margaret, who is going to leave us.
I have a question.
Yes.
So you're not going to hear from our group?
We don't have time to hear from all the groups. I'm
Okay.
sorry, Michael.
Okay, I understand that. And I understand that you have to time these meetings short enough that you can not hear from everybody. I mean, I'm not suggesting climate change is important enough to have a 3-hour meeting. I mean, this is the Diocese of Massachusetts. Nothing is important enough in this diocese to have a long meeting.
Michael, for the sake of honoring everyone's time, I'm going to need to, if you want to chat with me and Lisa after, we can do that. We can chat by email or have a conversation, but I need to wrap it up, and I want to end it with prayer. We've covered a lot of territory tonight. We've had some very stimulating thoughts.
I move that in the future, these meetings be longer.
Thank you.
I want longer meetings.
Thank you.
I know that this is against diocesan spirit, but
No, we welcome more conversations. Thank you for that enthusiasm. I agree. This is a big, rich conversation. But I want to honor people's commitment for tonight because I know people are planning to wrap it up at 8:15. So I'm going to invite us, since we've been doing a lot of talking, I'm going to invite us to stand in body or spirit, as is comfortable to you, for a closing prayer together. So if it's comfortable to you, I invite you to feel your feet on the floor, to take in the support of the good earth beneath your feet. And this is a very simple 4-part gesture, 4-part body prayer. It begins with placing the hands at one's heart, and this might be the intention to be present, to be mindful, to be aware of the divine presence in our midst. The second gesture is a little bowl or cup with our hands. We offer what we can. The third gesture is one of receiving. It's giving yourself a big hug. It's taking in the love of God. And the fourth gesture is one of giving it all away. No need to hoard. There's plenty more where that came from. So again, the intention to be centered at the heart, offering what we can, receiving the mercy and blessing, the love of God, sharing it. And we can connect it with the breath. So here we begin with breathing in, then we breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. Let's do it one more time together with the breath. Thank you, friends. May God bless us and keep us. May God's face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. May God lift up the light of love's countenance upon us and give us peace tonight and every day forevermore. Amen. Abide in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.